everybody, it's Laurie Rubidge with BeYourBestTV.com. I am so excited to introduce you to this interview. When we thought about all these different people that we're interviewing, we've got a big interview that we're doing here at my house tomorrow. And we thought, what is the first one we're going to send out? Because the first one, right, you never get a chance to be able to redo the first one, right? The first one is going to be something that you'll remember for the rest of your life. And so I could not think, it hit me so strong last week. I'm like, I know exactly what we're going to do. I know exactly the interview that we're going to send out on our very first show for BeYourBestTV.com. And that interview is with this amazing gentleman. This is my dad. He was a World War II fighter pilot. I am so grateful to God to have been his daughter. I am so honored to be his daughter. Every person I tell that my father was a World War II fighter pilot, they're like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. And I'm like, I know. And what do they say? A lot of times that many people will say it's like one of the greatest generations, if not the greatest generation. And just an incredible gentleman. And I am so honored to have had him as my dad. And I am so blessed to be able to share this interview with you guys around the world. We were doing a speaking event. Many of you probably remember in Chicago. And the reason you probably remember, it was back in the 90s and we had too many people there. And it was in the suburbs of Chicago, and we were supposed to only have 1,000 people there, and I think there was 1,600 people that showed up for our speaking event. And so what happened is, like, you know, the fire marshals came in, and it was just a crazy weekend. And somebody came up to me and said, I know your dad's a fighter pilot, and, you know, would you allow me to be able to sit down with him and ask him some questions? And I said, well, I'll ask him. And they said, well, you'll, you know, have the tape and everything else that, you know, I won't use it for anything. It's for my own personal use. And I said, well, let me ask him. And we have this incredible interview that my father was able to share. And I'm so proud to have you guys hear the story of him talking about one of his missions in World War II. And if any of you are World War II buffs, I think you're going to really enjoy this. And just any of you guys that knew my dad, many of you around the world, I'd love to be able to have the comments below if you met my dad, or, you know, just different experiences with him, because he's one of the greatest human beings that I was blessed enough to not only have in my life, but have as my father. And so I'm so proud to introduce to you Mr. Fred Rubidge, sharing about one of the missions and one of his stories on World War II. So I hope you enjoy. God bless you. And nothing could be more aha for me to know that this is the right interview to send out for our first interview at BeYourBestTV.com. So I hope you enjoy. Thanks so much for watching.
All right, when I first went in to the service, I enlisted in the aviation cadets in December of 1942. I was 18 years and 1 month old when I was sworn into the aviation cadets.
And where did you train for this?
Well, I went to Carlisle, Pennsylvania for some college training, and then I went to Montgomery, Alabama, or to Nashville, Tennessee, rather, where they classified us as pilot, bombardier, and navigator. And I was classified as a pilot. And then from there I went to Montgomery, Alabama, which was Maxwell Field, which was a pre-flight school, which they gave you ground instruction and military courtesy and lots of parades and lots of schooling. And from there I went to Clarksdale, Mississippi, which was a primary flying school. And I started flying PT-7 or PT-23s, which was an open cockpit two-place training airplane. And after I flew 70 hours there, learning a little bit about aerobatics and formation flying stuff, or regular flying and aerobatics. Then we went to basic flying school, which we flew bigger airplanes, which was the BT-13. And the BT-13 was a faster airplane, and it had a bigger engine in it. And then we learned formation flying. We started instrument flying, and orientation flying and stuff like that, and more acrobatics. And after 70 hours there, I went to advanced flying school, where it was advanced single-engine fighter school, where I flew AT-6s, where we had more advanced instruments and more advanced aerobatics and more advanced flying. Night flying we had then, and a lot of tactics and stuff like that. And when I left there, I graduated and I was commissioned a second lieutenant, and I received my pilot's wings.
Were you drafted into the war, or did you want to go?
No, I volunteered as an aviation cadet. I had a volunteer. I went in before I had to be drafted, quite a few months before I would have been drafted.
How come you picked Air Force instead of Army or Navy or anything
Well, because
else?
I wanted to fly. I always thought that I would be a good pilot, and I wanted to fly.
Did you have any trouble in learning anything, or were you afraid that you wouldn't be good enough or anything like that?
Oh, you're always apprehensive about whether you'll make it or not all the way through. Actually, probably of every 100 guys that started out, there are probably only 20 that made it all the way through, that graduate. There was a lot of washout rates. In fact, in advanced flying school, they washed out 1/3 of our whole class. Out of 100 graduates, there was 35 that were washed out in advance. So it was kind of tough to get through all the way, because the standards were high, and they didn't want to take anybody that wasn't what they considered, that could understand all the stuff and do it the way they wanted it to do. The military flying is different than civilian flying, that it's very precision and very, everything must all jump at the same time. Like when there's a rendezvous of airplanes that come together, if it's like at 09:36, the rendezvous, when the fighters rendezvous together, it has to be at 09:36, and it can't be at 09:37, because at 09:36 they head out and no stragglers are allowed. You have to be there, and it's precision, so they're strict about the whole thing. We had, a lot of what they would call, we had white glove inspections when we were in cadets, where they would come around every morning and inspect our rooms and the floor and the closets and everything with white gloves, and if there was any dust on the gloves, it had to be, you would get tours to walk in the area, and it was every tour was 1 hour. They had to march back and forth in absolute silence and in a military way, and turning around.
Did you have to walk in no matter what weather it was?
Regardless of the weather, yes, whether it was raining or whatever, you had to walk at the time appointed, and you walked. You just put on a poncho and you walked in the rain if you had to. During these tours, punishment tours they call them, You had to be very careful about what you did, how you kept your room, how you conducted yourself, and if your buttons were all buttoned on your uniform, and if your hat was on straight and your shoes were shined. They were very strict on all that stuff.
After you graduated and got your wings, what did you do next?
Well, the next thing I did was I went to Eglin Field, Florida for gunnery practice, and it was fighter gunnery training, which while we were there, we had ground gunnery and aerial gunnery, which was the ground gunnery consisted of shooting at targets on the ground, diving from an altitude of about 1,200 feet in the air down to about 50 feet in the air, and shooting at targets on the ground, and then zooming back up to 1,200 feet and making a circular pattern as a training for ground gunnery and strafing and stuff like that. And then we also shot at aerial targets where they pulled sleeves, they call them, behind an airplane, and we made fighter passes at the sleeves where we made attacks like we were attacking an enemy aircraft, and we made these passes at the sleeves, and they scored hits. And what they did is in each flight they would have the bullets were painted, the head of the slug was painted blue, green, yellow, or red, and that way they could tell how many hits you had going through the sleeve, because when the bullet went through the sleeve, it left the blue paint on there, and they could tell how many hits you had, and could tally up a score of, there'd be 4 airplanes at a time that would make these passes at the sleeve, and it was to show you how to lead the target and stuff like that. As a gun platform, a fighter aircraft, you had to point the whole airplane in the direction where the bullets had to go, because the guns were fixed in the wings, and you had to point the whole airplane at what you were shooting at, and that was to teach you how to point your airplane at the target and hit the target.
Well, after that, did you go overseas?
No, not right then. I went to transition flying in P-40s, the old Warhawks, if anybody ever heard of them now. They had the old P-40s. And then I went to P-47 Thunderbolts to transition fly those, which was they call it, what a P-47 was a single engine fighter. There was one man, one pilot only that flew this airplane that weighed approximately 14,000 pounds, and it had 8 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, and could carry a 1,000-pound bomb under each wing, and also rockets. It was a pretty well armored first-line fighter for the time then. I started flying this thing at this aircraft at an air base outside of Washington, D.C. At that time they called it Camp Springs Army Air Base, which is now Andrews Field, which you may have heard of. And we flew transition flying there, which was more formation, more getting used to this heavier, bigger, faster airplane, which actually would dive at 700 miles an hour, which doesn't seem like much in these days, but at that time it was pretty fast. And then from there I went up to Millville, New Jersey, which was Millville Army Air Base, which is kind of close to Atlantic City, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And we flew aerial gunnery out of there, the ground gunnery and aerial gunnery, which we flew out over the Atlantic Ocean. And we strafed ground targets and fired rockets and did a lot of dive bombing and stuff like that. It was kind of a congested field, and a lot of times if we'd run into trouble with the farmers around there and stuff like that, sometimes the cows got shot and stuff like that by mistake, because it was a real congested area that we were flying around, and sometimes we get some irate farmers that would be calling up the field and complaining that the airplanes were shooting on their farm, and actually it was sometimes it was a case of mistaken identity. And we also used to fly cross countries at 50 feet in the air, which seems pretty low, but we couldn't go any higher than 50 feet in the air and no lower than actually touching the ground. But we'd have to fly long periods, like 500 miles of cross country, where we never got any higher than 50 feet in the air. And the reason for this is that radar that the enemy had out would catch airplanes coming that were higher up in the air, but flying at an altitude of 50 feet in the air would get under the radar, and a lot of times you could reach the target, whichever you were assigned to hit, under the radar, and they wouldn't know you were coming, so they couldn't get ready for you with the flak guns and stuff like that. So that was the whole idea of flying that low. We learned an awful lot of low flying. We did a lot of that out over the water and over land and stuff like that. So it was, kind of thrilling, really, because at that altitude, you really know how fast you're going. And anybody that's ever flown in a modern jet today in an airplane, you go up to 35,000 feet, and it seems like you're not moving at all. But if that speed was transferred down where you were just above ground level and everything was passing by you real fast, you would realize how fast you were going when you're sitting there at maybe doing 400 miles an hour past ground objects. There's a real sense of speed. It would be like going 400 miles an hour in an automobile. It would seem like you're really going fast. But this would be at an altitude of 50 feet in the air, which would give you the same sensation that you would get in a car, but you were, of course, above the ground a little bit.
When you went overseas, where did you go?
Well, I went over to the European Theater of Operations. They used to call it the ETO, which was over in England and France area, like that.
What was a typical mission like?
Well, the officer of the day would wake you up about 6 o'clock in the morning, which was kind of early. The teletypes had come in the night before, or early in the morning. The teletypes had come through on what targets we were to attack, or what kind of mission we were to fly. And then the OD would wake you up about 6 o'clock in the morning, and you went over to get dressed and cleaned up halfway into your flying suit. And then you went over to chow. The chow.
What is an OD?
OD means officer of the day, which they had every day. There was an officer that was assigned that duty to wake up the pilots and know which ones were scheduled to fly and that. Well, after we had chow, we went over to the operations room where we had briefing, and the ones that would brief you would be who would be the group leader that would lead the whole group. What there was 16 airplanes in a squadron, and 48 ships or airplanes in the whole group. And there was 3 squadrons in the group. Well, we would either go out, sometimes only in squadron formations, just the 16 airplanes, but many times we'd go out in whole group formations, which would mean 48 total that we would go out with. At briefing, as I said before, the officer that would brief you would be the leader of the whole group. If you were going out with the 48 airplanes, it would be the group leader. If you were going out with just the squadrons, it would be the squadron leader. But it wasn't necessarily the squadron commander that would lead the group and or the squadron. It would be a case of it could be as low as a first lieutenant that would lead it. It was generally a man that had a lot of experience and had flown quite a few missions that would lead the group, because he had to get us there and get us back safe. But what would happen is they'd tell you about what kind of flak to look for over the target. They'd send reconnaissance airplanes out to kind of take pictures, and photo reconnaissance they call them, take pictures, see what kind of flak guns were guarding a specific target, and seeing what kind of airplanes were on the ground, and what kind of fortifications were had and stuff like that. So it would give you some kind of an idea about what to expect as you got over the target. And another briefing was given by the intelligence officer, who interpreted photo maps, and they sent down from wing headquarters intelligence on the area. And there was a bomb line, which they called it, that there was a big map on the wall, a great big map, and it had a red line running all the way down, and they would change that hourly or daily or whatever. Whenever the American troops would move up in advance, they would have to change the bomb line to show the pilots where the Americans were, so that anything over this bomb line you could assume was enemy, and so to keep you from strafing your own troops or doing anything like that. So they tried to keep that up to the minute as far as intelligence went. Well, after briefing, and they told us what target we were going to, and they told us a safe course home, which was the last thing they told us. And in other words, if you got hit real bad, they always gave you a safe course. In other words, from the target, your course, of course, we were always heading back. It would be heading west, so, you know, it'd be something like 252 or something like that. It'd be safe course home. In other words, if you got hit real bad over the target and you were having trouble flying the airplane, you still had your magnetic compass, what you would do is just head out on 252, and that was the closest way to get home from anywhere near the target. At least you'd take you over your friendly territory as fast as possible, or the fastest way, in case you had a bailout or something. The idea was to try and get across the friendly troops on the ground as soon as possible, so that if you had a bailout, you'd bail out in friendly territory instead of enemy territory, which sometimes, you know, if you went down in enemy territory, they weren't too friendly. They wouldn't just capture you, but they did kill a lot of the fellows that bailed out safely, but when they got on the ground, they were killed by the enemy civilians and or SS troopers, which were dreaded. The SS, you probably all heard of them, were real dreaded troops. But anyhow, then we would, getting back to after the debriefing, we would all set our watches at the same time, so that we would all know exactly you have the same time on our watch, so that we start engines at the same time, we taxied out at the same time, and we joined up the formation all together and in a particular slot. And everybody was assigned a slot to fly in, whether you would be a squadron leader, and then each flight, there would be 4 airplanes in a flight. There would be a flight leader that would lead the 4, and then it would break down into 2 elements, which would be an element leader and a wingman. So you would have, in a typical flight of 4 flights in the squadron, in the flight we'd have the flight leader and his wingman, the element leader and his wingman. And you never split up, tried to at least not split up, less than 2 airplanes together, and that was so that the other airplane could protect the tail of the first airplane. The wingman always protected his leader's tail. That was the main job of the wingman, as far as in running into combat with other enemy fighters or anything like that. It was always 2 ships stayed together as much as possible to help each other out in case one or the other got in trouble. And you never would split up less than the 2, unless it could happen, but you tried to join up. If there was 2, say that if 2 airplanes were shot down, then the 2 survivors, the other one would join and form a 2-ship element for protection again. In other words, you always try to stay 2 together. But anyhow, you'd go out to the airplane, the crew chief would strap you in, put on your parachute, and then when the time arrived, a certain time, all the engines would start at the same time. And you started the engines, and then everybody would taxi out in their position. And they had a mobile control on the ground that gave you a light. You couldn't see straight ahead out the airplane. You had to look out both sides when you were on the ground, because the engine stuck out so big in front of you, that they had a mobile control, would give you a green light, and you rev the engine up to full throttle. When he'd give you the green light, you release the brakes, and you went down the runway and took off. Then we made one circle of the whole field and all joined up together, and then we headed out to the target we had been assigned to that day. Sometimes enemy fighters would come up to meet us, or sometimes we would strafe airfields and try and get enemy fighters to come up and get us, and we would go down from an altitude of about 8,000 feet. We would roll it over and head which kind of looked like you were going straight down, but you weren't, and come in on the fields and try and shoot up the airplanes that were parked on the ground, and also to try and catch any ones that were trying to get off to come up and meet us. If that was our assignment, then there was always a lot of flak around the airfields. They had a lot of flak guns around there to try and catch us because they really wanted to protect those airplanes and that. And if it happened to be an airstrip that we'd go in and strafe, or maybe drop bombs, if we had bombs that day, we'd drop those and then strafe also. We'd go in and strafe marshalling yards where all the trains gather together, troop trains that are going down through the mountains and down the road. We attack those, and trucks carrying supplies, and they would call the controller. There was air controllers that they had around, these little Piper clubs, like they flew around, and they would call in air support when some troops would have trouble taking a town. The air controller would call for any fighters that were in the area to come down and knock out the guns and armor that were in the town, so that the infantry could move into the town. And we did a lot of that kind of stuff. And all in all, it was kind of tough, and a lot of the guys were killed. But I think that we all did a pretty good job, and it's something that none of us will ever forget. I mean, as long as we live, we always remember that. And we do have a reunion once every year, and I've only been to one of them, but where the guys get together, and you'd think that they were all 20 years old again when they meet and start talking together about the old days. It really is a lot of great. Well, I hope that this is what you were looking for, and happy days.